What did this alien say about 2026? That question hangs in the air like the last note of a bell that refuses to fade. The answer, according to the man who met it, arrived in the kind of whisper that isn't spoken but felt. An image slammed into him in the middle of the night, and it has not let him sleep since. Paul Stevens should have been asleep. He had every reason to be. At 62, he kept hours that matched the slow gravity of retirement. Mornings with coffee and the newspaper, afternoons in his small workshop where he sanded chairs and repaired cabinets, evenings with the television muted because it felt too loud for a man who had learned to listen for smaller things. But grief lives in its own time. Grief had rearranged Paul's nights. His wife, Linda, had been gone 3 years. She left the house quieter than the room should have been. Paul fixed that silence the only way he knew how, by filling it with work. Sanding oak made a sound that seemed to pull him out of the long corridors of missing. The rasp of sandpaper, the whisper of dust, the smell of sap. On some nights, he would wake at 2:11 a.m. The number still stuck in his head from when Linda used to slip him a note with 4 ones on the kitchen counter for luck. On other nights, a cardinal would tap at the window and sit there as if to remind him not all things are gone. The synchronicities at first were small, the kind of things a person can dismiss. A billboard clock that stopped at 11:11 as he drove past, a neighbor's radio playing a song Linda used to hum, a string of vivid dreams that seemed to move in a pattern, 17, he would later count, all variations on the same corridor of light and a voice he couldn't quite place. Paul chalked them up to loneliness, to the brain's attempt to stitch meaning into emptiness. He told nobody, not even Diane next door, who once caught him staring at the old oak tree and asked too softly if he was all right. He wasn't looking for miracles. He was sanding a chair. The night the ship came, a wind had rolled through that smelled of coming rain and green things, sap-sweet, raw. Paul worked without a radio, elbow deep in shavings, when the workshop lights flickered and a low hum filled the air. An even, deep vibration you felt more in your teeth than in your ears. The clock on the wall read 2:40 a.m. Outside, something touched the edge of his field of hearing, the way a bird might, and then the world tilted like a stage that had been nudged. In the yard, a shape hovered, not the hulking silhouette of stereotyped machines, but a smooth metallic sphere the size of a small car, suspended inches above the grass. Its surface shimmered, not chrome, not mirror, but like a pool of melted silver in which the night sky swam. For a few seconds, the only sound was the rasp of his sandpaper and the call of a distant cardinal, incongruously bright in its smallness. Paul stepped outside, because he couldn't not. The grass was damp against his bare feet. A moonbeam skated across the sphere. The air around it had a cool clarity, like the moment just after you open the freezer door. He later described the light as bluish silver, a color that seemed to drain away the ordinary hues of the world and replace them with a quiet intensity. Up close, he could see the surface was not perfectly smooth, tiny ridges like growth rings, as if the sphere had a memory of its own making. There was no hatch, no clumsy door. The sphere unzipped the night with a soundless motion, and something stepped out. Tall, lean, humanoid, not the grotesque caricature of film, but an elegant being with limbs too long for its torso, and skin that caught the light like oil on water. Its face was both alien and vaguely familiar, a suggestion of cheekbones, of eyes that tilted inward, of features smoothed as if through a river of time. The first contact wasn't a voice. Paul felt it inside his chest and behind his eyes, the way you feel a song before you know the words. An impression rather than language, not words but a pattern. It was like the sensation of someone presenting you with a photograph and expecting you to understand the scene without a caption. Images layered over each other, an ocean, a city, trees growing through ruined concrete, then a single hard-edged symbol, 2026.
He would later insist that the being did not speak the way humans do. It conveyed, he said over and over, as if the repetition of that verb anchored him to the memory. It did not speak. It placed images and a certainty. In the moment, Paul felt both terrified and strangely buoyed, as if the floor had dropped away and revealed a whole new set of supports under his feet. The being's first clear message, what it made him see and what he now retells, was that 2026 marked a hinge, the beginning of a process the alien called a bifurcation. Paul used the word bifurcation precisely because that is the word he remembered the images trying to explain: a split, a fork. The vision showed two patterns overlaying the same space, like two transparencies placed one on top of the other. The alien conveyed, according to Paul, that between 2026 and 2033, those overlays would become increasingly distinct. It would be easy to listen to this line and write it off as a delirium of a grieving man. It would be equally easy to let the spine-tingling oddness of the scene push us into mockery or wonder for its own sake. The only responsible thing to say is this: Paul experienced something he could not reconcile with ordinary life. He believed it enough to change how he woke up in the mornings, and that change is what lifts his story out of private strange into something people ask about. When he tried to tell Diane the next afternoon, he found he lacked the words. Diane has known Paul for 15 years, barbecues, neighborhood watches, arguing about the price of lumber, and she had a practical streak. She squinted at him over her glasses and said, "You saw something, Paul. Was it like a dream?" He put his hand in his pocket and felt the ridged edge of a sanding block, the thing grounding him to the reality of sawdust and sun. "Not a dream," he said. "Not like the dreams. It's as if I was shown a choice." What follows are the outlines Paul remembers most clearly, the things that burned in his chest as distinctly as the smell of oak shavings. And the way he talks about them always circles back to a few images: two earths, radio dials, and the idea that the small acts of daily life were levers in a machine he had never believed existed. Think of a radio. Paul heard that analogy in his vision. Two stations occupying the same room. At low volume, you hear noise and overlap. As you turn the dial, one station becomes clearer while the other fades. According to the alien in Paul's vision, human consciousness operates like that radio dial. The world does not physically split in a way that would be obvious to everyone at once. Rather, realities become more or less accessible based on vibrational alignment. This is the moment when the testimony moves from spectacle to instruction. Paul's first night of contact did not end in a single, neat revelation. The being did not hand him a pamphlet. It layered impressions. A city where streets were crowded but hushed. A park where children played without the thin divisions of screens between them. Hospital corridors humming with the sound of healing. Not miracles in the way Paul had once hoped for his wife, but systems that functioned differently because people moved through them carrying different weights. And then the reverse. Neighborhoods where neighbors no longer looked up from fear, where small kindnesses dried out, where language grew tight and brittle. The alien conveyed these as contrasts, not judgments. What made Paul stagger later was not only the images, but the framing. The alien did not demand loyalty or crack judgment. It positioned these possibilities as outcomes, not verdicts. Choice is cumulative, Paul would say. Think of a river. Drop pebbles in it every day. Over time, the bed shifts. The being used the metaphor of a tuning fork to show how resonance works. Touch the tuning fork, and the air fills with a note. According to Paul, it said that thoughts, emotions, and repeated actions create resonance. Habits set a tone. He described the sensation of understanding that this was not a threat in the headline sense, no trumpet of doom flashed, but a structural change in the environment of consciousness.
It felt like being told the rules of a game I'd been playing blind my whole life, Paul told anyone who would listen. The way he said the rules implied that knowing them made strategy possible. The way he said blind admitted to the failure of imagination that kept him in safe skepticism for so long. After the contact, Paul felt, for a time, utterly exposed. He went home and sat on the edge of Linda's side of the bed, where the pillow still held the faint impression of her hair. He tried to sleep, but kept waking at odd times, compelled to list every small action he had ever told himself would never matter. He began to notice his own breath, how often it was shallow and tied to worry. He woke one morning and wrote down 3 things he was grateful for before putting on his boots. An ordinary, almost silly act that in the weeks to come would accumulate into something steadier inside him. Paul's recounting of the contact is thick with ordinary details because he believes they matter. He remembers the cardinal that sat on the fence the afternoon after the encounter, the way it tilted its head as if asking a private question. He remembers the exact rasp of his sandpaper when he returned to his workbench, and how the shavings seemed to glitter oddly in the new light of things. These details are the stitches he uses to hold his tale together. They are also a clue to the kind of change the vision demanded: incremental, practiced, domestic. There is an urgency to the alien's message that is unmistakable in Paul's retelling. The word hinge is not rhetorical flourish, it carries an edge. According to what Paul remembers, 2026 is not the only year of consequence. It is the beginning of a window. The being suggested that between 2026 and 2033, the overlap between 2 patterns of reality would grow less ambiguous. In Paul's words, the lines that are fuzzy now would start to sharpen. For some people, walking between those lines would get harder. Paul does not claim to have seen who will be where or to know the moral calculus that decides outcomes. He stresses free will and compassion. It never said the other place was bad, he told Diane as she pressed coffee into his hands one gray morning. It said it's different, and it said those differences would be felt as separation. That word, separation, kept returning. Not punishment, but divergence. Not damnation, but a bifurcation of experience. The town reacted to Paul's story the way small towns often do to extraordinary claims, with a blend of curiosity, distance, and polite disbelief. Teenagers would stop at his driveway to ask what he had seen. A couple of local blogs fussed quietly about mental strain and grief. Diane agreed to sit with him and listen, a presence that grounded his otherwise scattering recollections. For Paul, the hardest thing was the knowledge that the thing he had been shown would not be obvious to everyone. He felt a sudden responsibility, like the kind that settles over people who have learned CPR or saved a life. The sense that having seen something, you must share it, even if only to preserve the possibility of choice for others. The alien's presence also brought with it an image that followed him for days. 2 hands, palms open, hovering over a table. On one hand lay a handful of seeds, on the other, small tools. The impression was simple. Tending matters. Nothing about that image promised escape, magical crossing, or favored status. It implied work. Paul found that notion both terrifying and strangely liberating. Work meant something concrete to do. He began to test the edges of the vision. If the alien had linked reality to frequency, then perhaps frequency could be shifted not by extraordinary rituals, but by everyday acts. He started small. 5 minutes of gratitude upon waking. A 20-minute walk in the woods without his phone. A moment of forgiveness towards someone who had hurt him, first himself, then another. He did these things not because the being had handed him a step-by-step guarantee, but because action felt better than the paralysis that grief had taught him. When he told Diane about these micro-practices, she took them without ceremony and adopted a few herself. If only to feel less like a spectator, she said. In the weeks after the contact, Paul noticed other phenomena, what he calls soft signs. Repeating numbers appeared more often. 1111 on clocks, receipts with the same digits, a license plate that read 1111. A cardinal would visit with unerring timing, as though to check on him. His dreams shifted from frantic memories to vistas that gave him shapes and outlines of the alternate patterns the alien had shown. He began to keep a small notebook by his bed and write down the dreams as if transcribing a map. Paul does not claim these signs mean anything beyond what he experienced. He says they were confirmation for him, not an argument he can use to persuade others. "Look," he would say when people pushed, "I have no proof. I only know what I felt, and then how the world started to smell a bit different afterward." That phrase, "smell a bit different," is emblematic of the kind of testimony Paul offers: sensory, humble, tenacious. It is crucial to underline here that Paul frames everything as his experience. He refuses to make pronouncements about others. He repeatedly emphasizes that the alien, if that word must be used, was not a charismatic preacher, but an informer of pattern. The way he tells it, the being made no effort to inspire fear. It instilled urgency by showing, not by shouting. It was as if equal weight was given to warning and to handing me a broom, Paul says. In other words, the answer to the haunting question the title asks is not merely a prophecy, it is a summons to practice. When Paul describes the alien's manner, he uses human analogies constantly, because they are the only way he can keep the memory from dissolving into strangeness. The being communicated like radio, signals, tuning, resonance. The image of a tuning fork keeps returning in his speech. Strike it once, and the room reverberates. Strike it repeatedly, and the note becomes a presence. According to Paul, the being showed him multiple tuning forks resonating in a room, some louder, some fainter, some harmonizing.
The metaphor was simple but elastic. Resonance is not one-off. It is repetitive, habitual. A week after the encounter, Paul sat in the church basement at a community meeting. He had gone because he felt the need for a public anchor, a place where the ordinary business of life made sense. People around him bickered about zoning and who would volunteer for the soup kitchen. He listened, feeling simultaneously removed and compelled. When a woman stood to request volunteers, Paul realized, oddly, that his hands had changed. Years of carpentry had made him practical with tools, but now his hands felt gentler. He found himself raising his voice to volunteer for the repairs at the shelter, not because the being had instructed him to do so, but because the image of hands, tending, remained lodged in his chest. That blend of the mundane and the surreal fascinated him. It was one thing to have a vision, it was another to have it migrate into ordinary choices. He felt, finally, a way to honor Linda's memory that was not clinging to absence. Linda had been someone who loved people by making them sandwiches, by knotting a scarf just so. If the alien's message was about cumulative resonance, then perhaps turning small acts into patterns could be a way to honor a life and reshape a world. Not everyone listened kindly. A few neighbors called him eccentric, suggested stress and isolation might be at work. A local pastor offered a cautious ear, but warned against making fear the engine of faith. Paul took the criticism with the weary politeness of someone who has learned that truth often arrives rubbed with mud. He did not seek to convert. What he wanted was to stay anchored in his integrity, to do the work he believed might matter. The question that drives the rest of Paul's testimonials, the one that answers the title most directly, was hammered into him mid-contact. The alien's image of bifurcation was followed by something sharper, a timeline. Paul insists the being showed markers, not edicts. 2026 was portrayed as the year the thread began to separate visibly enough that people would notice patterns. 2033 was shown as a sort of endpoint, a moment where the overlapping would be less porous. How exactly that would look, the being did not dictate. It showed possibilities, doors closing softly, a tightening of resonance, the increasing difficulty of moving between states. Those were the contours, not the scripture. The word haunt is apt because Paul's recollection of those years is not cinematic fireworks. It is an image that keeps returning, uninvited. He pictures a hallway of doors, each with a small plaque. Some doors open easily from either side. Others require time, patience, and the right angle to slide. His sense is that 2026 begins the corridor where those doors become more like thresholds. When asked whether the alien offered a map, practices, techniques, incantations, Paul's face softens.
He remembers the being handing him not a map, but a set of gestures, simple and repeatable. The thing that would make the difference, according to his memory, was not secret rituals, but the disciplined repetition of ordinary acts. This was the part of the story that drew Diane in, and later, others in the small circle who would visit him on odd afternoons. They tried the gestures, not as magic, but as ways to sculpt attention, and found in the small acts a kind of steadiness that seemed to alter how they met the day. If you are wondering whether Paul's story is a call to isolation, fear, or doomsday prepping, it is not. Even in those early weeks, Paul refused to interpret the vision as a moral scoreboard. He uses the word compassion a lot now. He speaks about people who might remain in the lower pattern with the same tender resignation he would use when discussing an old friend who chooses a path he would not. "Not everyone will go where I'd like them to," he told Diane at one point, "and that's not for me to judge." His sense of mission, such as it is to be a steady presence, an anchor, not a recruiter. It is here, as the first contact settles into daily routine, that the story deepens. The initial shock of the night becomes a pressure to change habits. Paul begins to notice not only external signs, but internal shifts. He sleeps differently. He dreams differently. He forgives more easily, often beginning with himself for the small cruelties that grief had taught him. He forgives Linda for dying. He forgives himself for not stopping the cancer in any practical way. Forgiveness becomes an exercise rather than an announcement. It is a muscle he flexes, sometimes clumsily. One afternoon, as he sanded a chair back into smoothness, the workshop filled with a faint hum. Not the low frequency that had announced the ship, but a quieter, human-scale resonance, like the settling of a house. He paused, hand on the wood, and felt suddenly that the difference between his life before and after the contact was not cataclysmic, but cumulative. The real work, he realized, was to keep making decisions, small and ordinary, that would tune him toward the frequency the alien had shown. At that point in his story, the vision started to show deeper layers. Images so vivid Paul would later say they haunted his nights. He saw streets where people looked up from their screens and offered each other water, gardens threading through apartment blocks, schools where children learned to listen to each other. He also saw places where walls went up higher, where families drifted toward screens and distrust. These images were not simple morality plays, they were textures. He could name no exclusive path to the first place, he only felt that certain behaviors made it more likely. He began telling close friends, those who would ask and who meant more than curiosity. He did not preach. He offered his experience as one man offering a report. "I was shown a fork," he would say, tapping his thumb against the table. "I was shown the handles of the fork and how each was being tended." For Paul, the haunting part was not that the alien had predicted doom, but that the message installed a responsibility. Tending matters. Now, months after the contact, Paul wakes earlier than he used to. The old insomnia has mutated into something different, a deliberate practice of presence. He spends the first 5 minutes of the day naming things he is grateful for. Small things, like sun on the kitchen counter, the way the mug fits his hand, the smell of cut grass. He calls his daughter more often, not to excuse himself, but to listen. He volunteers twice a week at the community shelter and brings a sense of steadiness to people who are brittle. These acts are not guaranteed tickets to any promised place, but Paul believes they tuned him. He believes they changed him. There is another layer to Paul's testimony that is harder to convey, the sense of being watched by a future as if it were both near and opaque. The alien did not give him a prediction in a single sentence. It delivered a series of field notes, a catalog of potentials. It showed rates of separation, described the hinge of 2026, and pointed to a window that would close over the next several years. Paul often uses the phrase window narrows to describe the years between 2026 and 2033. That narrowing is not a wall dropping, but a subtle shift in permeability. Movement becomes more difficult. When the being showed him examples of what it meant when movement became harder, Paul saw everyday analogs. A child who used to be able to climb a fence, finding the top suddenly harder to grasp. A door that used to swing easily, now sticking because of swelling. He took these images literally and metaphorically. It's about friction, he later explained. When you're in a habit that doesn't care for the inner life, when your days are loud with fear, the friction is like sap swelling the wood. Doors don't swing well. At this stage in his narrative, Paul had not yet received the more explicit list of practices the alien would later articulate. What he had were impressions and a growing set of domestic rituals: gratitude, presence, nature time, forgiveness, small acts of service, quieter speech, community. He experimented with them. He was clumsy. He failed. At times he lapsed into bitterness and old habits. That fallibility is central to his story. It keeps him human. The alien's image of the tuning fork came with no promises, only the implication that repeated attention creates resonance. If you stop him on a bench and press him for a single sentence explaining 2026, Paul will look at you as if you asked a question about the weather. It is a hinge, he will say. It is a beginning. It is not a nail that will drive fate through the world, but a lever that makes certain outcomes likelier depending on how people act. It begins to show, he says, and showing makes choice real in a new way. His voice softens when he speaks of Linda in this context. She would have hated the showiness of all this, he confesses. She would have wanted me to be useful. That sense of usefulness, of turning grief into service, becomes for Paul the practical center of the haunting. If what he was shown was real only to him, then his task was to make it matter in workaday ways: fixing a roof, listening to a neighbor, learning to forgive a slight. It is here that the night of the contact resumes in his recollection, not as a single glowing event, but as an ongoing sequence of revelations that kept unfolding. The alien, he says, showed more, images of what a higher frequency community might look like, of ways in which communication could be more direct and less clunky with machines and with each other, of challenges and of comforts. It hinted at a kind of reunification with those who had passed, how Linda's presence could be felt not as a ghost, but as a different kind of closeness. Yet he quickly cautions against reading these passages as easy reunions or promises. He is careful to frame them as impressions, possibilities that depend on work and resonance. On a rainy afternoon, Paul sat with Diane on his porch and told her about a moment inside the vision that had rattled him. He had been shown two versions of the same park bench. In one, people passed with heads down and phones in hand. In the other, a woman sat quietly, a child reached out and held her hand, and a man across the way nodded with the kind of recognition that passes between strangers who are not enemies. It was ordinary things, he said, but ordinary done differently. The thing that haunted me was that they were both possible, and people choose them in small increments. Paul's testimony never stops circling that smallness, the idea that the sum of tiny acts might determine whether, when the window between 2026 and 2033 widens and then narrows, a person finds that the air is tuned to a frequency they can live in with ease. The haunting quality is not apocalyptic fireworks. It is the shiver you get when you realize your daily patterns could be the architecture of future reality. The contact left him with urgent calm. He does not wake screaming. He wakes intentional. He tells his daughter little of the details because he knows some things cannot be carried by others. He tells her instead that he's trying to be kinder, more present, a better listener. For him, that is the translation of what the alien showed. And then, in the darkest part of that first night, after the hum had subsided and the sphere had vanished without fanfare, the vision returned and pressed close. The alien conveyed, through images that felt like someone letting sunlight pour through their fingers, an emblem,
2 overlapping circles, each made of different light. The circles walked apart slowly, like dancers taking separate steps.
2026, Paul says quietly, was the first step. It is at that moment that I will stop for now, not because the story is complete, but because the air changes and wants attention. The image of those circles, drifting and pulling like tide and moon, lingered in Paul's mind. He could smell sap and ozone together whenever he closed his eyes. He could hear a faint cardinal call at odd hours. He felt, unavoidably, that something had been asked of him, to notice and to act, in the way a gardener notices seedlings and waters them before frost. If you are sitting with this story and feeling a chill, that is part of the point. Paul's testimony is designed to unsettle and to orient. He was shown a hinge, 2026, and told, in the strange, persuasive way of visions, that how one lives each day matters. He was not handed a guarantee. He was given a set of images, an idea of cumulative practice, and a slow, insistent invitation to begin tending. The next steps in Paul's tale are the work he did after that night, how he practiced presence, how he learned to forgive without fanfare, how he watched for signs and responded with small, steady acts. Those are the parts that show whether the image of a hinge is a threat or a summons. They are the parts where grief becomes instruction and the ordinary becomes the site of possible transformation. For now, the image of the 2 circles, the sound of the cardinal, and the rasp of sandpaper remain as fingerprints on the memory of that night. Paul locks the workbench and walks back into the house where Linda's picture still leans against the mantel. He pours 2 cups of tea out of habit and sets one aside. Not because he believes she will return in bodily form, but because ritual steadies him. Outside, the neighbor's porch light clicks on, and the world goes on its slow, astonishing rotation. The alien's message about 2026 was not a neat prophecy handed down in a sentence. It was a field of images, a metaphor, and a call to practice. It began in a sphere of silver and ended, for Paul, in the slow work of living differently. The hinge had been shown. His choices, he suddenly felt, would be the small tools that might keep the door from creaking shut. If you want to hear more of what Paul says he was shown, what the 2 overlapping patterns looked like in full, the specific small practices he was given, and the signs he learned to watch for between 2026 and 2033, stick with this story. For now, the hum remains just under the silence, like a warning bell you can only hear if you stop and listen. If this is landing on you the way it did on Paul, strange, insistent, impossible to ignore, pause for a moment and subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the rest of first-hand accounts like this. After that first night, the alien's message unspooled into a surprisingly practical set of instructions. Paul would always insist he did not receive a list of secret incantations or cosmic cheat codes. What he remembers, again and again, were 7 simple habits the being conveyed as levers, small, repeatable actions that set a tone in a life. It spoke through images, a weathered hand opening, fingers touching a tuning fork, light pooling in the cups created by cupped palms. In Paul's telling, each habit was framed not as a guarantee to cross anything, but as a way to tune the instrument of his attention. These are the 7 practices Paul says the alien conveyed, and how he translated each into a manageable, everyday step. 1. Gratitude on waking. Paul began with 5 minutes every morning devoted to naming 3 small things he could feel grateful for: warmth in his chest, the mug cooling in his hand, the hush before sunrise. The micro-action: set an alarm 5 minutes earlier and speak the 3 items aloud. Paul kept it simple. Thank you for this light. Thank you for this chair. Thank you for this breath. The alien used the phrase priming the tone, a quiet click before the day begins. 2. Presence at work. Whether sanding a chair or answering an email, Paul learned to do one task with full attention. The micro-action. Before beginning, take 3 slow, deep breaths and put the hand on the work, a literal grounding gesture. The being compared it to tuning one string on a violin before the orchestra starts. The rest follows more easily. 3. Daily nature time. The vision emphasized contact with living systems. Paul started with one 20-minute walk without his phone. No podcasts, no lists, just the cadence of his breath and the feeling of earth underfoot. The alien's image was of roots interlacing under pavement. The micro-action. Find a patch of green and spend 20 minutes noticing textures, bark, moss, the sound of a cardinal. 4. Forgiveness practice. Not grand proclamations, but a short daily exercise to unclench bitterness. Micro-action. Write a 1-sentence note releasing one grievance, toward yourself first, and crumple it. Or simply exhale a 5-count forgiveness breath aimed at the memory. Paul said he forgave clumsily at first, stuttering through the breath, but the repetition loosened something inside him. 5. Service without spectacle. Small acts of helpfulness, carrying a neighbor's groceries, fixing a broken step, bringing soup to someone who lives alone. Micro-action. Aim for one small anonymous act of help each day. The alien's image was of hands passing a bowl across a table. Paul took the image literally and began doing practical things Linda would have done. 6. Inner dialogue and listening. Set aside 10 minutes to sit quietly and listen inwardly, what Paul called speaking with the quieter room. For him, it took the shape of sitting with Linda's photo and allowing himself to imagine what she might say. But he stressed caution. This is an inner practice, not a seance. Micro-action. 10 minutes of stillness with a prompt, what does my heart notice right now? And a willingness to write down whatever arises.
7. Conscious community. Cultivate one small circle, a neighborly call, a weekly walk with someone, a simple circle where people check in without trying to fix each other. Micro-action. Reach out to one person each week for honest listening. Host a monthly meal where conversation, not screens, is the priority. Paul and Diane tried these habits in fits and starts. None of them felt miraculous on day 1. Some days he forgot. Some days grief pushed like a heavy coat. But the alien, as Paul remembered, did not promise fireworks. It conveyed persistence. Tuning is repetition, Paul would say, tapping the edge of his sanding block. It wasn't the ritual, it was the returning. The being also framed the matter of timing. Paul became careful with language here, always saying as shown or as conveyed in the vision. What he insists he saw was a window, 2026 beginning a process, and 2033 marking a narrowing. That is how he recounts the timeline. 2026 starts the hinge. The next several years are an unfolding where patterns become more distinct. By 2033, the overlay is materially less porous. He uses a simple image, 2 panes of glass slowly sliding apart until the seam is easy to see. He never called it deterministic, he called it consequential. In the same way, the vision gave a range for how many people might notice or be primed for the higher resonance. Paul quotes, carefully and with humility, that the alien showed figures, rough, impressionistic, something like 10 to 15% who were more aware, those who would move with relative ease. About 80 to 85% would remain rooted in the other pattern, more preoccupied with survival in the narrower sense. He always prefaced those numbers with the phrase, as conveyed in the vision, that qualifier keeping the encounter framed as testimony. What would these overlapping worlds feel like in everyday life? Paul's account gave a series of signs and symptoms, not as a checklist to spark paranoia, but as a landscape to be recognized. He said the vision showed that as the window widened, some phenomena might surface. Divergent memories, people telling stories of the same event with details that cannot be reconciled, what some call Mandela-like effects. Paul experienced this himself when a neighbor insisted a fence had been red last summer when Paul clearly remembered it blue. Subtle disappearances, not cinematic vanishings, but people whose patterns simply no longer overlapped with others. Someone who used to take the same bus route now seemed to exist in a different rhythm and was hard to reliably meet. Paul described this as the fading of mutual appointment. Communication breakdowns, technological oddness, messages that look like they've been sent but never arrive, or conversations that seem to fall into static. The vision painted this as two threads fraying, making shared language thin.
Family splits, increasing divergence of memory and priorities. Households where relatives drifted into different priorities and moral universes, not necessarily because of malice, but because their world tuning had shifted. Tech anomalies and institutional strain. Small breakdowns in systems, servers misaligning, maps that no longer match what someone remembers, are shown as symptoms, not causes. Heightened polarization. Louder rhetoric, more brittle political and social identities. Environments where fear tightens muscles and narrows attention. Paul was careful to say these signs would be confusing, even frightening, and that confusion does not equal breakdown of sanity. He urged compassion. The vision made it clear, he told anyone who would listen, that a person on the other side of the seam is not a villain. They are living by different tuning. That doesn't make them less human. What practical advice did Paul gather for coping with such signs? Again, his tone remained resolutely ordinary. Grounding first. If you feel disoriented, pause and do a 3-breath exercise. Feel your feet on the floor, name 5 things in the room. The alien's language for this was, return to the instrument. Document gently. If memories diverge, keep a notebook. Paul kept his bedside dream journal and a small ledger of odd occurrences, times and dates of repeating numbers, uncanny coincidences, conversations that later read differently. Prioritize relationships over proofs. When family memories diverged, Paul learned the hard way that insisting on being right sowed more separation. He asked questions instead of correcting, saying, "Tell me what you remember," and then holding both narratives with curiosity. Seek community. Whether a church basement, a kitchen table, or a local shelter repair crew, shared practice reduces the sense of singularity. Paul found that the act of showing up mattered more than an argument about where reality had shifted. Reach out to professionals when needed. Paul included this as a firm boundary. If cognitive or mental health concerns emerge, seek qualified help. The alien's vision did not replace therapists or doctors. It is important to notice how these suggestions are the opposite of doomsday prepping. They are small-scale, relational, and humane. That was the point the being, by Paul's recollection, returned to again and again. Agency is exercised through ordinary, sustained attention. As the months accumulated, small outcomes began to take shape in Paul's life. These were not miraculous proclamations, but shifts in tone, synchronicities that felt like quiet confirmations, and relational repairs that required patience rather than proof. His daughter, whom we'll call Ellen, had been distant since Linda's death. Where there had been a thinness in their conversations, awkward pauses, and carefully guarded grief, Paul's persistent practice changed the way he approached her. He stopped trying to fix her hurt. He simply listened longer and asked one unassuming question after another. How did that make you feel? What memory do you want to keep? He called without agenda, and in time, Ellen began to call back when she remembered something small. The fissure did not close overnight, but there was an important scene that felt like a hinge. One evening after a volunteer shift at the shelter, Ellen sat with Paul on his kitchen steps. A cardinal landed on the fence and cocked its head. Paul did not mention the alien. He mentioned the way the light fell on the garden, and he asked about her job. And when she started to cry over something mundane, a lost job offer, he did not rush. He offered coffee and a steady hand. In the pause between them, Ellen reached for his and said, "Dad, I don't understand most of what you say about all of this, but I see you. You're different. You're here." That line, "you're here," was the first payment Paul felt for the daily practice. Presence returned something he had feared permanently lost. Paul also described softer apparitions of hope.
A neighbor he had argued with for years stopped by to borrow a ladder. The argument dissolved into a shared laugh about weather-resistant shingles. A teenager on the block who had been sullen and silent began to join the calls for community cleanup. These were not universal conversions. They were local patches of repair that felt like the seeds the alien had shown him. Each small act of service was like adding a pebble to a stream bed. Over time, the channel shifted. At the same time, there were harder scenes. A cousin, tightly wound by fear and conspiracy theories, withdrew from family dinners and refused to speak about the vision. An old friend stopped returning calls. A local storekeeper accused Paul of going off the rails. Those losses hurt. Paul acknowledged them with the gratitude practice, naming the pain, letting it be, and then continuing. The alien, in his retelling, had never promised smoothness or universal approval. The being had been practical and unsentimental. Tending would sometimes cost you social ease. A particularly disorienting episode involved a small series of missing appointments. The community center scheduled a repair day, and 3 volunteers who had always been there did not arrive. They did not reply to messages. They were later found fine, living in schedules that no longer overlapped with the center's pattern. Paul described this as an example of the fading of mutual appointment the vision had hinted at. It was painful but not catastrophic. The team adapted, others stepped up, and the repair got done. The alien's framing, as Paul remembered, emphasized resilience over drama. By the second summer after the contact, Paul had become an informal hub for a handful of people. Neighbors, a local teacher, Diane, and a man from the next town who said he had seen something similar years ago.
This small network, no more than a dozen, met once a month to practice presence, to do a group nature walk, and to offer mutual aid when someone needed it. In the alien's imagery, these were the people who held a note. Paul never used language of exclusivity. He said often, "We don't sit in judgment of who comes and who doesn't. We show up to keep a tone." Those who gathered did not agree on metaphysics. One of them worked in IT and treated the patterns as metaphorical. Another had a spiritual practice that involved candle lighting and careful prayer. Another treated it as a psychological exercise in attention. The meeting's value, Paul said, was in the multiplicity, how different frames converged on the same small acts. They found that when they practiced gratitude aloud, walked together without phones, or took turns describing a moment when they felt their heart unclench, something in the communal field shifted. People left quieter, steadier, more able to face small challenges without reactivity. That was the payoff Paul was willing to claim in public. Presence begets presence. There were also moments of deep tenderness that Paul framed as echoes rather than proofs. In a dream he had, and he was always careful to call it a dream, Paul saw Linda standing on a shore of light, hands full of small wildflowers. He woke with the smell of sap in his nose and the warmth of a hand that was not physical. He told his daughter about the dream not as evidence of an afterlife promise, but as a private consolation that helped him continue the work. For him, those interior moments were not instructions to be had. They were encouragement to be sustained. As the years rolled toward the hinge, the community Paul had helped form began to notice small public patterns that matched the vision's description. Local councils argued more loudly. Neighborhood newsletters took on a suspicious tone. Technologies occasionally glitched with baffling frequency. Again, Paul framed these as correlated, not causal. He would say, "There are patterns that make people nervous. That is when simple practices matter most." People in the area asked Paul what to do if they encountered someone whose memory diverged from theirs. His counsel was modest. Listen more than you correct. Document to keep a sense of continuity for yourself. Protect your mental health boundaries. If someone seemed to be losing their grip on reality in a clinical way, he urged reaching out to professionals. The alien's vision, in his recollection, never suggested isolation. It suggested connection. There were also questions about whether the vision gave any sense of moral sorting, whether goodness or righteousness determined where someone ended up. Paul rejected the idea that the being issued moral judgments. It didn't say good or bad, he told Diane once, pausing over his tea. It said resonance.
The practical corollary was that people could, through repeated attention, shift how they moved through the world. But the vision did not paint those who did not shift as unredeemable. Compassion was a steady theme. One of the more haunting images the alien conveyed concerned reunification, an image that always made Paul's voice catch. He was shown people in a garden exchanging a look that felt like reconnecting with someone who had been dead. The being did not promise full-bodied resurrection or doctrinal certainties. It presented possibility as a quality of resonance, the sense that a relationship could be experienced anew under different tonal conditions. Paul treated this as a deep invitation, not a guarantee to be sold. For him, the possibility of a new kind of closeness with Linda was part of what made the daily work worth it. By now, the audience might be asking, what does this mean for 2026 specifically? What happens then? Paul always replied in the same careful cadence. 2026 is when the pattern shows itself everywhere, he would say. It is the year when the seams that have been soft become visible enough that people notice and have to choose what to do about it. He described 2026 as a kind of accelerant, not sudden catastrophe, but a time when cumulative habits begin to bias experience in noticeable ways. Paul painted 3 nested stages in the years following 2026, again prefacing each with "as conveyed" and with notable humility. Early stage, 2026 to 2028, increased awareness. People began noticing odd overlaps, memories that slip, misaligned appointments, a rising sense of being unmoored. For the relatively few who had already been practicing presence, the differences seemed like clarifications. For most, the scene was confusing. Middle stage, 2029 to 2031, consolidation. By this phase, the overlaps started to feel less ambiguous. For some, meaningful everyday experiences began to align consistently with one pattern or another. Movement between patterns became more effortful. Small habits either prevented friction or compounded it. Late stage, 2032 to 2033, narrowing. As the vision depicted it, pathways that once allowed easy mutual understanding became harder to traverse. By 2033, the seams were less permeable. Paul used the word permeability deliberately. He never said closed or final. He described it as a nature of difficulty, doors that stubbornly resisted being opened without sustained, careful effort. In the vision's arithmetic, those percentages, 10 to 15% aware, 80 to 85% remaining, did not read as a cosmic census so much as a pattern one could observe in probability. Paul said the alien used images of fields and scores to show relative resonance.
He did not use the numbers as bets to be made. He used them as field notes to prepare people for likely social effects. More households where people did not share the same lived timeline, more institutions straining to keep common languages, and a wider demand for networks that could hold different experiences without burning bridges. That demand is exactly what the small group around Paul tried to meet. They became what he called holding practices, not evangelists, but people who practiced steady kindness and service. They put their hands on floors that needed repair. They sat with neighbors who had lost jobs, and they offered quiet confidentiality to those who were frightened. They also tried to model a way of living that wasn't driven by fear. Paul's life was not transformed into a narrative of heroic victory. He failed as often as he tried. He had days when old resentments crept in, and nights when he woke with a tightness in his chest. But the parts he held on to, the gratitude ritual, the 10 minutes of inner dialogue, the weekly phone call, became the architecture of his resilience. He noted that the tuning fork image remained instructive. Even a badly struck tuning fork still has a note if it is struck often enough. There were moments of public friction around the story. Local media ran a piece that framed Paul's account as an eccentric human interest story. A few people wrote angry comments online calling it a hoax. But perhaps more instructive were the private conversations, like the one he had with a woman named Maria, who had been widowed, and who told him that since she had started the gratitude practice, she slept better and could think of her husband without the same razor of pain. "If this is only helpful to me," she said, "then that is enough." Paul cherished those sentences. He began to suspect that the alien's message, if it's to be taken as message, was less about proof and more about practical transformation. Toward the later part of the timeline, the group began to prepare a resource folder: simple practices, a reading list, contact numbers for therapists and local aid programs, and a short guide to grounding exercises. Paul insisted the folder remain humble. No promises of crossing, no exclusive language, just things that helped keep people's feet on the ground. He pinned this as a resource on his community bulletin, and, in time, a local church offered space for a monthly meeting. This is the kind of infrastructural kindness he believed would be most useful as the years advanced. Paul's relationship to Linda softened into a new work. He no longer sat with her photo waiting for visitation. He sat with her picture as a prompt to be useful. In the garden that spring, he planted a small bed of wildflowers where their names were stitched in small stones. Visitors sometimes stopped and left single blooms. He took the act as both homage and practice, an external ritual matching an internal recomposition. He said that in those moments, the sense of maybe that had haunted him for months felt less like a torment and more like an invitation. The alien's image of two overlapping Earths is, in Paul's account, less a map and more a parable, an imaginative structure showing how tiny, repeated choices create social architecture. By the time the story had circulated beyond the town, people began asking Paul what he would wish for others. His answer was simple and staunchly relational. Don't withdraw, don't preach, begin with what you can do today. Bake bread for someone, say the morning gratitude, sit in a park without a phone, forgive yourself, show up. When the first days of 2026 arrived, the town did not split like a television show. There were no spectacular ruptures, there were moments of recognition. More people began to notice repeating numbers, cardinals showing up at unusual times, and odd discrepancies in memory that created small domestic tensions. For some households, the shift was barely perceptible. For others, it required a reorientation of daily life. Paul kept his ledger and his gratitude list. He kept sanding chairs when he could. He kept showing up as the being had seemed to encourage, with ordinary tools. There were ethical dilemmas too. People asked whether to warn loved ones. Paul advised gentle invitation rather than alarmist proselytizing. He told the story of a son who berated his mother for buying into nonsense when she started attending the gratitude circle. The son stormed off, and the mother felt wounded. For Paul, the lesson was to keep love unconditioned on agreement, serve the person, not the argument. As the years edged toward the later markers, the group matured into a local resource, not a movement, but an available archive. They published a short pamphlet with the 7 practices in plain language and practical microactions, and a link to community resources. The alien, in Paul's retelling, never touted any single philosophy. The being's insistence was on attention and tending. Tending is not a creed, Paul would say. It is a set of habits. There were critics who read the vision as a justification for social fragmentation. Paul took their concerns seriously. He wrote letters to a few editors, explaining that the experience had taught him to love people where they were, not to judge. He volunteered for the soup kitchen in response to an op-ed that had used the story to stoke division. For Paul, the only response to fear is another set of hands. By 2030, some local networks had hardened into 2 different kinds of rhythms: groups centered on presence and mutual aid, and communities more oriented toward closed information loops. In Paul's view, the split was not moralization. It was a consequence of different attentional investments.
He wondered, not without sorrow, whether some relationships would not realign. He also believed that tending could create pathways back if people opened themselves to small practices.
The alien's image of reconnection lingered in Paul as an ethical project. He wrote small notes, unfancy, handwritten, to people in distress. He repaired a fence for an elderly neighbor and refused payment. He sat and listened to people who were terrified. His life became the modest response the being had suggested, hands on the table and the slow work of tending. There came an evening, several years after 2026 had begun, when Ellen and her young daughter walked into Paul's little workshop with something to show him, a small wooden stool the child had made at school. It was roughly sanded, painted with broad, enthusiastic strokes of color. The child handed it to Paul with a solemnity he had not seen before. "For Linda," the child said, as if the name was the most natural invocation. Paul felt the rasp of his sandpaper like a familiar language in his hands. He set the stool on his bench and traced the paint with a finger. The moment felt like a small proof of a different future, a child connecting across the ache of absence to make something that honored a life. It was not a grand reunion. It was an ordinary act of memory and generosity, and to Paul it mattered more than any tableau in a vision. Toward the concluding years, Paul remained adamant about one thing. The alien's message about 2026 was not an ultimatum, but an invitation. He refused to package it as a certainty. He refused to use it as currency to shame. He would say, "I was shown a hinge." For me, that hinge meant waking up to the power of daily tending. If that helps another person sleep or be kinder, then the vision did something useful. When asked, finally, what did the alien say about 2026? Paul offered a summary that is both stark and humane. It told me that 2026 marks the beginning of a visible separation, an increase in the distinction between ways of being. It said movement between those patterns would become harder over time, and that what mattered most wasn't fear, but tending, tiny acts done again and again. It did not say who would or wouldn't be where. It showed tendencies and gave tools. His last advice to anyone listening was as practical as the first things he had done. Start with 5 minutes of gratitude tomorrow. Take one walk without your phone this week. Do one small act of service for someone who cannot repay you. Keep a journal of small changes. And, most importantly, stay compassionate. "If this is only my experience," he told Diane once, "then at least it has helped me be less brittle." The concluding image Paul returns to, the one that keeps the title haunting, was the two circles, overlapping and then stepping apart like dancers. He would close with a small, almost mischievous phrase that nevertheless landed with weight. "The line begins to show in 2026, he would say, "but the line is only as sharp as the hands that tend it." If you felt that chill at the beginning, let it be a prod rather than a panic. Paul insists this is one testimony among many, and that responses vary. The alien's message, as he experienced it, is a summons to practice, not a blueprint for fear. If this account has struck something in you, curiosity, concern, or the slim hope of being steadied, there is a pinned resource with a plain guide to the 7 practices, a short FAQ covering the timeline as described in the vision, and links to local community resources that prioritize presence and mutual aid. It's optional. It is not a promise. It's a set of tools some people have found helpful. As the evening settles in Paul's town and the workshop lamp throws a small pool of light on a half-sanded chair, the cardinal calls once more from the fence. He lays down his sandpaper, breathes slowly, and speaks the 3 things he is grateful for. The rasp of wood under his hand is a small certainty in a world of uncertain seams. In that quiet, the memory of the sphere and the image of the 2 overlapping circles remain. They haunt him in the best way, by asking him what he will plant and how often he will water it. What did this alien say about 2026? In Paul's words, it marked a hinge. It asked for tending. It did not tell him fate. It showed him practice. And for a man who had spent years filling silence with the sound of sandpaper, that felt like instruction enough.